which shaped the United States and made it what it is. One of the reasons you don't understand nations, you don't understand the intention in the foundation of the nation and who the nation was made for and how it
for this evening, Dr. John Henrik Clarke. Let's give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. It's been quite some time since I've been here, and I've been all over the country and lecturing at different schools and on what is called Black History Month. And I've decided to call it Africana History Month because one thing about the word black, it tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are. And I've said before that the name of a people must relate to land, history, and culture. And the word Africa is embedded in the word Africana. So that means all African people, Caribbean Africans, African Americans, Africans in Africa, and the Africans in the Pacific. One of the reasons why I have missed not being here is because I have been doing a lot of work on spirituality in the last year or so, more than in recent years. And more than in recent years, I've come to believe that our assault on our enemy is going to have to be cultural, spiritual, and physical. It's going to have to be physical too, but it's going to have to be cultural and spiritual. And when we speak of spiritual, I'm speaking of the kind of spirituality we had before Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I am not talking about when we had no religion, because we have always had religion. I'm talking about that period of spirituality before someone broke it down into denominations and began to start dissensions between people based on who belonged to which one. All right, now, my subject for tonight, and this is the 9th in a 10-lecture series. There's one more lecture to go in this 10-part series. Then I will take some time off to systematically plan the African American series of lectures. And it deals with African resistance movement, and my focal point is the 19th century. My focal point is the 19th century because we have to look at the 19th century again, not just in Africa. We have to look at the 19th century again all over the world, because the 19th century was the greatest century that we have lived outside of Africa. This was the foundation century. It was the century of the building of the black church. It was the century of the agitation for independence, for agitation against slavery. The first half was the century of agitation against slavery. The first half was also the century when Haiti agitation met Napoleon and drained the French treasury to a point where he had to sell the Louisiana territory when 3 black men, Toussaint Louverture, Jesse Lane, Christophe, stood up against this fascist Frenchman and did not yield and drained the French treasury to the point he had to sell Louisiana and that territory in order to recoup his money to continue his stupid wars in Europe. Now, Napoleon might be a hero to you, he's an idiot to me.
That's right.
But now, and yet, this country would not be the same except for these 3 black men who dared to stand up to him and wouldn't let him take Haiti, wouldn't let him re-enslave Haiti. That's the first half of the 19th century. Also, the first half of the 19th century in the United States, that was the century of Frederick Douglass. That was the century of the building of the black church, the rise of the AME Church, century of Broderick and Richard Allen, the century of the Freedom Journal, the first black newspaper, Frederick Douglass's North Star, and Douglass's Monthly, the first half of the 19th century in this country. The century of the dynamic black preacher in this country. The century of a great preacher like Henry Highland Garnett, whose motto, he said, is resistance, resistance, resistance. I'm saying that while my focal point this evening is on Africa, I could have a focal point any place in the world where there were African people and show you that we were internationally revolutionary during that century. And this was our golden century. And I'm saying that our movements today are weaker because we don't seem to know about it. We have not built successfully on that 19th century all over the world. That early part of the 19th century. Now let's deal with the early part of it and generally. Then I'm going to come back to Africa. I'm dealing with the part outside of Africa just briefly to let you know that there's a panoramic sweep of activity all over the world of African people active. It was the century of the settlement of Liberia. It was the century of the so-called Negro Convention movement. It was the century when Caribbean activists joined African American activists, and they did not separate themselves based on who came from what island, or who came from what state, or whose hair had certain gradation, and whose father and whose mother slept with what white man. They didn't separate on no basis, no stupidity like that at that time. They were all African people with the same problem and the same oppressor. And that's the way they dealt with the situation. They were clear. And they started a Back to Africa movement 100 years before the birth of Marcus Garvey. That was basically successful. It was also the centre when Martin Delaney went to Africa with a Jamaican, Robert Campbell, to search for a place for the settlement. And each one wrote a report. Martin Delaney wrote a good, well-documented, well-written report because he's a Harvard man, so Harvard men write good reports. Robert Campbell, a man with a limited education, wrote the best report. He wasn't a Harvard man, but he was a man with a great deal of feeling. And his report reads like poetry, called pilgrimage to my motherland. And while his report did not have all the polish of a scholar, it had feeling, it had humanity, it had insight into a man going back to Africa and celebrating the fact that this was his birthplace and his birthright. Robert Campbell's work could be reread today, and you can take it out of context and read it as poetry. It is so beautifully done. Now, if you're high-flown and you're worried about whether your adjectives and your adverbs are properly placed, don't read Robert Campbell. But if you want to know a man with human feelings toward his motherland, Robert Campbell's Pilgrimage to My Motherland is a classic little piece of work you need to read. All right, now, the first half of the 19th century in the Caribbean islands, because the first half of the 19th century here was the century of the massive slave revolts, Gabriel Presser revolt, Denmark Visa revolt, Nat Turner revolt. And this led to the agitation by the black abolitionists that subsequently led to the agitation that ultimately led to emancipation in this country. Now, let's go to the first half of the 19th century in the Caribbean islands itself. In the Caribbean islands itself, the Haitian revolt had set panic in motion in the planter system. But the longest series of votes really was in Jamaica. Jamaica had fought longer and harder than Haiti. And yet, because of a certain events in history, the British could put forces in or infiltrate in such a way and divide the people in such a way they could not bring off a unified state. And they fought over a 100-year period, while the Haitians fought generally over a 20-year period. And was just the fortunate circumstance of catching the French so completely off guard and fighting the French at a time when the French finally could send top-level troops in to try to retake Haiti. It was too late, and the Haitians were too stubborn and just kept on fighting, and fighting with the land, and fighting with the hills and the valleys, and malaria too, a general that helped them a great deal. Then the African drum driving these French stark, raving mad, that helped a lot. All right, now, as you look at, see now, because the British had emancipated or said something about emancipation before this period as early as the 1830s. But when it came to the 1850s, the Caribbean people understood the fakery of their emancipation and started their revolts again. In Jamaica, this led to the confrontation at Moret Bay. But Barbados, a model colony, then and now, is still a colony in mentality. Because they wanted to make it a model colony, they gave it a certain kind of treatment. But I remember on a few summers ago stating that Jamaica was physically bastardized, Barbados was mentally bastardized. One they dealt with the mind, the other one they dealt with the body. Then they split them into divisions. All right, now, that's the first half of the 19th century. But the second half of the 19th century in this country, the second half of the 19th century was the century after emancipation, when the abolitionists, all the white liberals that we thought were our friends, began to pull away from us, permitted the South to come back to power, and subsequently started the Ku Klux Klan and other organizations, and we were back in the same trouble again. Now, while you had a basis of constitutional law in the Caribbean, you had some structure, but you had something in the Caribbean we didn't have. You had a majority population. And while you have a majority, though you are under colonial rule, you have a different psychosis. You have a different mentality. And this different mentality, brought on by virtue that they could maintain some African culture continuity, and many times they were away from the oppressor and could develop certain basic cultural traits based on their togetherness. Near the end of the 19th century, it was practically all gone by virtue of one form of oppression, one form of cohesion than the other. And what the British did not win with weaponry, they began to win with a form of brainwashing that's still prevalent. To the point, this year, the 100th anniversary of the birth of Marcus Garvey, and we need to reconsider Marcus Garvey. In spite of the fact that his 100th year anniversary of his birth, there's not a single island in the Caribbean where he could function in peace right now. If he was in Jamaica right now, he couldn't get elected to public office. If he was in Grenada, they kill him. It's easy to lie about a dead man. You ain't got to deal with it. If he's here in Bedford-Stuyvesant, he'd get elected to anything. He'd make congressman out of it. But in Kingston, they throw bricks at it. Right now. He had no problem in Bedford-Stuyvesant. You get elected anything you want to get elected over here. You might make him lieutenant general. With or without a law degree. So he'd be all right over here. He wouldn't be all right in Kingston. Because the atmosphere that would sustain a Marcus Garvey does not exist in Jamaica of today. Does not exist on a single Caribbean island right now. In most parts of the United States, it does not exist. It does not exist in Washington, D.C. That color-conscious, class-conscious bunch of blacks in Washington, D.C., they chase him out of town. Better not go to Atlanta either. There's a crowd there. So let us be frank about where Marcus Garvey could exist in America right now. Where he could exist in the Caribbean. I don't know a single island where he could exist in the Caribbean. He couldn't exist in the Caribbean at all. You go down to the Caribbean, you hear people boasting about participating in the invasion of Grenada and rationalizing on the murder of Maurice Bishop. Now, what would they do to Marcus Garvey? All right, now let's get to work. We got a little job here on African resistance movements focused on the 19th century. But my main point is to let you know, while I am talking about 19th century Africa, our resistance movements were international. And all of us in the 19th century were very conscious of the fact that we had a world struggle, and we engaged in that world struggle. And we were more together then than we are now. We were less divided into little silly pockets based on islands and based on countries, based on sororities and fraternities and a whole lot of other nonsense. We didn't have all that. We weren't that worried about that then as we are now. See, we did not know then, as I tell some of my students, that, all right, you're talking about where you're from, who you are. Can you pass a taxi cab test? Will a cab downtown pick you up? They don't care whether you're from Africa, whether you're from the Caribbean island, or whether you're from Georgia. Your face is black. If it's kind of late at night, you ain't gonna get no cab. You're all the same. You fail the taxi cab test. all one. All one people. So in a negative way, this bigoted cab driver is a better pan-Africanist than you are. In a negative way, of course. All right, now, let's start with Africa in the 19th century. Because in the 19th century, slavery had reached a saturation point. All right, saturation point means everybody who wanted one had one. And they could breed one if they needed one. Therefore, more slaves for the market wasn't really much of a problem. They had shifted so many slaves out of Africa. They had depopulated large areas of Africa. Now, the United States had produced a fast ship that could outrun the British ships at sea. Therefore, the United States, that once brought most of its slaves from the British and the Portuguese market, was now going directly to Africa and getting its own slaves, still using more and more slaves because the invention of the cotton gin and the rise in the price of cotton being king economically, America had more demands for slaves than the others. So with the Yankee Clipper type of ships, mostly out of New England, America was going, bypassing the British market, bypassing the British blockade, and picking up our slaves directly from Africa. This is why the British began to get a fake reputation for benevolence by starting the British abolitionist movement with a faker called Wilberforce and Granville Sharp. Most of the British abolitionists were fakers. Most of them did not support any decent legislation in England improving the lot of the British people, especially legislation against child labor and the abuse and the use of women. So therefore, when they were crying crocodile tears over the slaves, they had no tears and no sympathy for the common people in England. And Wilberforce, so-called Christian, when he met Equiano, the African, the most brilliant of the African slave narrators and writers who had traveled a great deal, he was really an educated man, educated more than some of the whites he met. Wilberforce could not shake his hand and said so, I could not bring myself to put my hand in his hand and call him a brother, though he was a Christian the same as I am. So Wilberforce's religion did not prepare him to accept another African as a Christian. All right, now, the African slaves in England itself had been emancipated slowly, not out of benevolence, but because the British working class, with its large unemployment problem, seeing these Africans with these nice jobs, nice, they interpreted nice, footmen, coachmen, said that they wanted those jobs, and their agitation eventually led to the emancipation of the African slaves, and the British began to dump them at Sierra Leone. Now, the British, with their customary sense of humor, once they dumped the African slaves at Sierra Leone, they found 2 shiploads of British women, ladies of the evening and ladies of the night and ladies of whatever, ladies with no visible means of support except the use of their charms. We call it charms for the want of a better name. They dumped those people, those ladies, into Sierra Leone. England was very good at getting rid of its scum. Europe dumped its human garbage can into the New World. The worst of the lot came to the United States. One thing the Caribbean people and the African people never appreciated is that the black American had to deal with absolutely the worst white people ever. They had to deal with the worst that Europe could offer, the leftovers, the discards of Europe, and we're still dealing with the discards. These people just don't think. They don't make no kind of sense. What they're doing, they don't make no kind of, you can't figure them out no kind of way. They're even against each other. All right, now, as we as Africa faced the beginning of this century, let's take it from the top. Let's look at North Africa. In North Africa, what do you have? You have Egypt under the control of foreigners, Maluks, Armenians, Turks. While the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, have retreated, they've left behind administrators and people holding on to power. They even have a combination Armenian and Turkish royal family on the throne of Egypt. King Farouk, that little fat degenerate, was an Armenian in combination Armenian and Turk. And he had all kinds of women and men that he performed all kind of relations with. But the Arabs, who are Puritans, pretend to be Puritans in sexual matters, came to him and said that you can treat these foreign women any way you want to. We have no control of that. But if ever you misbehave this way with a genuine Arab woman, we're going to kill you no matter how much it takes. And ultimately, they did drive him off the throne. But these were, let's deal with his descendants first. Because Muhammad Ali was one of his descendants. Now, Muhammad Ali is the prize fighter who really is not brilliant. I met him changing planes in Miami, and I told him, if you wanted an African name, why do you consult somebody who could give you a genuine African name? This is the name of an Arab slave trader. That's, the name that was approved for him. He submitted the name to Elijah Muhammad, and that's the name they approved. But they didn't know much about it anyway. But anybody could have told him that Muhammad Ali really was not a favorable black. He tried to turn Egypt toward the west and try to whiten up Egypt. All right. The main thing I'm trying to get at is that foreign control of Egypt and North Africa was intact at the beginning of the century. The English wanted a peace, so she had to try to drive out the Turks. And the French wanted a peace and had to drive out part of the Turks. So the French got Morocco. The English took part control over Egypt. Then, when the Egyptians got in trouble trying to take over the Sudan, the British rescued them. Then the British took over the Sudan, ostensibly in partnership with the Egyptians, but they were never in partnership. The British were controlling it all along. But all over Africa, there were revolts. There were revolts against colonial rule because colonialism was now gradually, slavery was now gradually turning to a more sophisticated form of slavery called colonialism. And the African who thought he was getting rid of one form of slavery was only inheriting another form of slavery, and he was beginning to catch on to this form of slavery. In North Africa, again, the French began to use the Foreign Legion, try to hold on to its holding. Now, the Foreign Legion and all the romance about it were nothing but a bunch of thugs recruited from all the waste matter of Europe, royal cut-ups and social misfits, and a whole lot of people who escaped, and some of them escaped criminals and wanted to hide their identity. But there was a whole lot of Hollywood romance and B-movies about them, but really they were nothing but well-dressed gangsters, sometimes on a horse. Now, the French, with the Foreign Legion, held their part. The British, who recruited African troops to hold their part, but the Egyptians tried to control the Sudan. And when the Egyptians tried to control the Arabs of Egypt, that's probably the best way to put it, because the Arab is not an Egyptian. When the Arabs of Egypt tried to control the Sudan and got hell beat out of them, they had to call for the British to rescue them, and in rescuing them, the British gained control both of Egypt and the Sudan. Now, this would provoke wars later on. Now you see the foundation of what is going to ultimately be the wars led by the Mahdi, the holy man who would free the Sudan from British rule, but later on, but not now. All right, now you see the war is spreading down the coast of East Africa, and the Arab had moved down the coast of East Africa. Had moved down the coast of East Africa surreptitiously, doing favors for certain families, marrying into the families, and playing the same kind of game he had played almost 1,000 years along that coast, marrying into African families and subsequently using this family, using in the slave trade and in his commodity trade along the coast. All right. He is a unique oppressor inasmuch as he recruits people in a physical way. This is a form of sexual conquest, because the Arab is a big womanizer and a big converter of the woman in her family as servants, and his trade, be it ever so illicit, this is the way he gained control of the East African slave trade and maintained this trade until the fakery of the British would bring him kind of frontally to bear with the fact that the African Muslim was really an oppressor. Not that the British was any different, it's just that the British had the kind of weaponry that could dislodge the Arabs from the East African slave trade. Now, the resistance in East Africa continued. And the resistance continued until East Africa and the Sudan. A young man whose people were very religious called Fakkers, Fakkers. These were religious Muslims, high religious Muslims, named Muhammad Ahmed. Now, this young man had rose to some prominence as a student because his family were puritanical Muslims, and he took on his teacher for permitting the students to frolic and laugh during one of the holy days. And they thought that because he did this, he must be some kind of future prophet. This is the character that you saw in the picture cartoon, so poorly portrayed and so inaccurately portrayed in the picture cartoon. Well, what did happen is that he went into a period of training in the Upper Nile. And when he was about 19, he asked that a wife be chosen for him. And this wife, that they left out of the movie, he asked that she be the prettiest and the blackest woman in all the Sudan. And so they found a person who had had 1 year of college training and a tremendously beautiful woman, and she was the #1 wife and remained so until a few years later he began to take on additional wives, and she had to approve of all the additional ones. And she converted all of this into a spy system that used against the British. All right, now, this one individual planning his wars against the British literally drove the British out of the Sudan and started a movement using Islam as the rallying cry. What you have to understand now is there are 2 Islams in Africa. This is what Ali Mazarui did not tell you in the series on the Africans. There are 2 Islams in Africa. One African, one Arab. The African side of Islam has used Islam as a rallying cry for reform. And so the Mahdi, that means after he became the holy man, that's what he was called, he began to use Islam as a rallying cry. But he united all of the Sudan, Muslim and non-Muslim. And some of his most effective fighters were those people, non-Muslims, called fuzzy wuzzies. They decided that they wasn't going to get a haircut or a shave until the British were driven out. They were magnificent warriors and great camouflage artists. They must have been some of the finest physically trained people ever, because they could stand, or fall right in front of a horse. And their knowledge of the movement of the horse was so good, they knew that at all times 2 of those feet are off the ground. And they would lean their body in such a way that the horse could pass right over them without hurting them. And then they would leap with a knife, they would leap and cut the throat on the rider behind. And before he falls, his knife is in the throat of another rider. This is what Rudyard Kipling said in his "Hey, ye fuzzy wuzzy, ye break the British square." That's what he was talking about. That British square attack, they would come in squares around you, come on, say, you know, come from all sides. That's all the fuzzy wuzzy wanted. All he wanted. You come up on him that way, you never dream again. Some of the finest hand fighters in the world. Now, with the fuzzy wuzzy, that's not his really name now. Yes. But the Mahdi got the upper hand in the Sudan. Then they sent in a colonial fighter who had distinguished himself in the Boxer War in China. Chinese Garvey. One of those one-dimensional British military men who are, well, we can't get into military men with gender problems, but he was one. So he had no concentration. When you rule women out of your life and rule all other things out of your life and just concentrate on the military, you know, you can concentrate real well over that. That's a whole lot of time you freed up with. Whole lot of energy too. But he was one of those like Kitchener. So Gordon was a Christian, had been there before, and he had some converts. But Gordon couldn't free the Sudan from the Mahdist grip, and eventually was killed by one of the Mahdist people, the Dongolas. Now the Sudan became free of British rule, and after the death of the Mahdi, the Sudan came under the control of a man of the Mahdi's choosing, Khalifa Abdul Hayya. Khalifa Abdul Hayya was an illiterate, stone illiterate, but a master on a horse, with a weapon in his hand, he mastered the Sudan. He was so unlearned about people. He saw a Frenchman, he said that, why these white tribes belong to, what part of Africa do they live in? He knows just thinking, France didn't mean nothing to him. That's the white tribe, must live someplace in Africa. But that man, he's left out of history. There's so many great heroes left out of African history. Khalifa Abdul Hayya. Ain't no question about who he is. There's enough pictures of him. Like the Mahdi, he was from the Dongola group, and the Dongola was the blackest people in the Sudan. Now, the British sent in another one-dimensional general, Kitchener, and he retook the Sudan. This war is reported by young British reporter Winston Churchill, and one of the great classics of war reporting called The River War. I'm not saying it's for you now. See, Churchill was a racist, he was unashamed of it. Churchill boasted of the fact that they killed 50,000 Africans in one evening. But it was great graphic reporting. I said it's one of the finest jobs of war reporting since Caesar came home from the war with the Gauls. But don't look for it being for you. It wasn't for you at all. It was for them. So sometimes if you're going to deal with them, you got to understand how they report on each other. Now the next war in East Africa was by a man named Muhammad bin Abdullah Hassan. The British called him the Mad Mullah of Somaliland. He was a great poet, a devout Muslim, and he had fought the British near the end of the century, and he had gone to Mecca and Medina. He had gone to preach in a city called Barbara, still in existence. And 7 years after he had failed at Barbara, he came to the edge of the city and said that Allah had told him to push the city into the sea with his feet. And he had come to do just that. But then he said that he do not want to harm innocent people. And if the British would turn over so much ammunition to him, so much this and so many arms to him, he might consent to spare the city. The British gave him enough ammunition to fight them 3 more years. They never laid eyes on him. He fought until the 20s, till after the First World War. Winston Churchill suggested that we put some airplanes on some ships and bomb his inland fortresses. And they bombed his inland fortresses. He retreated into Ethiopia, and he tried to proposition Haile Selassie's alleged father, Ras McConnell. And I won't get into the lineage of Haile Selassie. He was just as true as many other people sit on the throne, although there's some question about his parentage. He wasn't a McConnell. Because, well, I've seen Haile Selassie close up 3 times. And I've seen the McConnell close up more than 3 times. There was no McConnell eyes, there was not a McConnell nose, there was not a McConnell lips. I'm a specialist in studying facial features and family lineages as reflected in the physical makeup. Whoever Haile Selassie came out of, he didn't come out of the McConnell family. But that's a matter of no great importance right now. But Ras McConnell failed to recognize the Mahdi and to give him shelter. And he, not the Mahdi, but the mullah. And he came back into Somalia, where he died, and his followers heard that buried him, so no Englishman ever saw his face. All right, now, but the major wars in southern Africa at the end of the 19th century, beginning early in the 19th century, were the Zulu War. Now, you have to look at South Africa several ways. There were the Kaffir Wars, the wars of the people called the Bushmen and the Hottentots. That's not their name now. These are the Khoisan people and the San people. These wars against the Boers to keep them from taking their land and their cattle and their women, the 11 wars. Now, after that, there was the Zulu wars of consolidation. People misunderstand these wars. They think Chaka fought white people. Chaka didn't fight the white people. Chaka fought other blacks, tried to consolidate southern Africa so that southern Africa could be saved for African people. He was trying to build up a military force of blacks to keep whites out. And he almost succeeded. All right, now, after the death of Chaka, his half-brother and assassin, Dingaan, took over. And it was Dingaan that started the fight to keep the whites out of the hinterland. that stopped their wagon trails and burned their caravans. 3 times. Now the British saw, this is the 1830s, the British saw that if any whites were defeated, they may be next. And though they hated the guts of the Boers then and now, the British came to the rescue of the Boers, met Dingang on the Bell River, or the Fish River, or the Orange River, but so many butchered bodies flowed down that river during this battle. After the battle, it was called the Blood River. The Battle of the Blood River, one of the decisive battles for the control of Southern Africa. And I think October 16, 1838. And it is celebrated in South Africa in secret as Dingong's Day. The assumption is that when South Africans rise, it's going to be on Dingong's Day. They double the police on that day, and to this day, in South Africa. In the memory of Dingang, there's going to be a great uprising. 1840, they had driven him into exile, and he passed. Now, the Zulus came under the control of a puppet named Mpande. Mpande misruled the Zulus for 32 years. He was so ignorant and misguided, the British, just for the fun of it, wrote out his own death warrant and handed it to him, and he signed it. He was a fat slob, beer-drinking slob. The Zulus raised special women to be married only to the kings. He didn't marry any of those. He married common women, and he discarded them almost quickly. He discarded his clothes. He was a nobody. He was a disgrace to Zulu manhood. He let the Zulu armies deteriorate. But out of this man came a strong son. And this strong son became a favorite among the Zulu people. And he began to raise up the Zulu army one more time. And by 1870, he had driven his father from the throne. And he was king of the Zulus. His name, Cetshwayo. Cetshwayo now planned to rebuild the Zulu manhood, started the drilling over again. He began to beat up Zulus who were too fat, because you're too fat for war, you're no good for the Zulus. He brought back the old generals to train the Zulus. Now he started his own campaign for the attack. It took 9 years to really train. He looked among the different scattered groups, and when he could not find the adequate generalship among the regular Zulus, he looked among people scattered and attached to the Zulus. For his general command, he found a general among a people called the Borolong. They had attached themselves to the Zulus for protection in the absence of a great leader. This man, Mamboza, and his pictures in a book called Chaka Zulu. He was 74 at that time, not a gray hair in his head, not a wrinkle on his skin. He could be 34 or 24. He lived out in the open, exercised, ate good natural food. He was all a man. And he took command of the Zulu, and he began to put that army into shape. Now, if you see a picture late at night called Zulu, it's been coming and going for 10 years. The picture's in error. And they point to an old man on the hill commanding the troops. Well, that's not historically true, because Mamboza said one of his conditions for retraining the Zulu is that they give his son the command of the troops. All right. Now, in this battle, the scheme was to attack the missionary station to provoke the British for reducing his father to a puppet, using missionaries. So this place, Rockers Drive, that was the minor battle. That was the rehearsal battle for the main battle at San Helena, one of the classic battles in Zulu history. All right, now, and they will fight in a 3-regimental formation. White Shield Regiment, these were the recruits. Brown Shield Regiment, as a regular army. Black Shield Regiment, that's the Zulu elite guard. Now, the White Shield Regiment just hit the enemy, let him know the battle has started. They get out of the way. The Brown Shield Regiment gets in and tries to win. But if they can't win, they send in the Black Shield Regiment. And that regiment wins or dies. It never leaves the battlefield. That's the elite guard. Those are the only Zulus permitted to marry. Those are the only war Zulus permitted to marry. Special beer was brewed for them. Special women were raised to marry them. And the wish of the soldiers is to work from one regiment and to be a part of the elite guard. Striving. During the period of Sharka's reign, he kept on the eve of battle, he deliberately kept the men away from the women. He said, you need all the passion you got in war. War is nothing but a dispensation of passion. If you dispense it in one place, you can't dispense it in another. So after the battle, yes. Before the battle, got to save it for the battle. But this man, one of the great natural warriors, now as close to Chaka as possible, has come Kechiwayo, the one inheritor of Chaka. Now, he's faced the British at Rockers Drive. All he's trying to do is to lure them into his trap. The place called San Helena. Now remember, this is one of the great perfect battles of human history. And when Lippincott and Company commissioned certain writers to write on the greatest military battles in history, the first book was about San Helena. And this is the battle we're talking about. For he boxed the British in with the sea at their back, 2 mountains at each side. At the mouth of the mountain stood Kechiwayo on a horse, just looking at it. And for 3 days, he just stood there. And so finally he waved his hand, and the battle started. The British regiment literally destroyed. Churchill wrote about this one also in a book called A Roving Commissioner. Jerome Napoleon was killed in this battle. The Royal Historian of England has written a book on it. Sir Reginald Copeland, called San Helena, Battle Peace at San Helena. It's been written about in many books. Then Copeland wrote another general book called The Negro as a Soldier, a compliment to the men who fought to the caliber of Africans we faced at San Helena. Now, Kechiwayo would make a mistake. Same mistake many African heads of state make. He goes to England to see the Queen. Why? I don't know. Queen Victoria didn't know what was happening, didn't know what was up or down. She sees it, writes a letter telling her ministers to leave this man alone. After all, but they don't pay any attention to her. When he gets back They split his country into 13 pieces and divided his people against him in such a way he's no longer a ruler. Had he stayed home, he might have been able to hold it together. After they drove him into exile, the British breathed easier and said, "At last the Zulu has been broken." They had spoken prematurely. There was another man they had to deal with. His name was Lobengula. He inherited the second Zulu Empire in a place called Mashonaland and Matabeleland. And he had built up a sizable empire in this area in some kind of peace until a consumptive Englishman came into the area named Cecil John Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes wanted to control this part of Africa, and he began to instigate in ways of doing it. He began to put one African against the other, and when one African stood against the other, then he began to ask the British to punish one set of Africans for being against the other. He began to claim everything under the ground, above the ground, and everything anybody else happened to forget. He wanted mining concessions, and eventually he fought the war he wanted to fight. He bought off the emissaries of Lobengula, and he sent 3 sets of emissaries. He got one set drunk. Some of them got thrown overboard. But his letter never reached Queen Victoria until after he was dead. Finally, he drove Lobengula into exile. And Lobengula was followed by a small band of people who remained loyal. And then in his dying wish, he told them, "Go make peace with Cecil Rhodes. Go save your family. Go sweetly, go in peace." And when he died, they gave him a traditional Zulu king's burial. They were skinning a cow and taking all the bones out of the cow. So the hide of the cow becomes the coffin. And they put him inside, and they sew it up, and they bury him facing toward the domain of his people. So now, this is 1893. The British breathed easily again and said, "At last the Zulu has been broken." They have spoken prematurely. One more time. There are 2 more men they've got to deal with. It is a young king, Bambada, and an old king, Sigananda. Now, the Zulus had served as wagon masters and quartermasters during the Boer War. The British promised to remit their taxes. Instead of remitting their taxes, the British increased their taxes. Now, Bambada has been going to British farms, taking horses and cows, under the pretense that you didn't bring no horses here, you didn't brought no cows here, it all belonged to me. And so he goes to the old king, Sigananda, to get help. And so when he goes to Sigananda, he reminds Sigananda of what his father, that my father helped you when you were escaping from the British. This angers the old man, so he spits on the ground, and that's close to cursing. It might surprise you that there are no curse words in most non-Western languages. There are gestures of cursing, but no words. There's no word for goddamn. There are no words there's no words for condemnation in most of the languages of the world. Western man has words of condemnation. Most of the languages of the world have no such words. They have gestures or action, but no words. Now, Bambada goes to see Dennis Zulu, the last living son of Cetshwayo. Dennis Zulu said, "I've had enough of British jails. I don't want to be part of your war." Then in that double talk that is known to African people the world over, he says, whispers loudly so everybody can hear him, "While I want no more of your war, nothing to do with your war, anybody in this want to assist you, I did not see their form disappear, nor did I hear their footsteps as they departed to assist you." Sinjani, the last of the Zulu war planners, leaves with Bambada to plan the Zulu War 1906, the last of the Zulu wars. When Bambada gets back to Natal, Sigananda has already started the war. He didn't wait for the young man to come back. He is on the warpath. He is against the British. Now, he starts the war, he has 23 rifles. Not even a dozen. Then he discovers that the Zulus and the different soldiers working for the British and the Boers have got no uniform. It's just armbands. So he put some armbands on some non-workers and have them go picking up the British and the Boer ammunition and bring it over to him. And with this strategy, he accumulates enough guns to get the war started. Now, this war lasts 9 months, and it was pretty much successful. Then Bambada goes to the grave of Cetshwayo, as it is the custom. When you go make great decisions in Africa, you go to the grave of one of your ancestors to ask for spiritual help. And he was supposed to have been cut down on his way leaving the grave. It later proved he wasn't cut down. His wife did not go into mourning. Now, if you knew African culture, the British knew African culture, that would have been a signal that Bambada went someplace and hid. And that was a double that they killed. Now, but Benny's in his work on Dennis Zulu proved that Bambada lived until 1923. That after a year or so, his wife sneaked out of Zululand and went and joined him. Because she told the British, "My husband is not dead. His spirit will rise and lead the Zulu people." Now, the old man was captured later that day. The British describe him as arrogant. He was spitting on us, calling us vile names, and you would think that we were his prisoners. He was 95 when the war started. He was 96 when they captured him. This old man had lived through the rise and fall of the Zulu Empire. He was body servant to Chaka. He was one of the soldiers that guarded the grave of Chaka's mother. He had went during the period of difficulty with the Zulus. He went into the Congo and fought with another general called Tam Tam Anna. His story is beautifully told in a poorly written book called Chaka Zulu, A.E. Ritter. It is partly told in another book by Morris called The Washing of the Spears. It is partly told again by Anthony Hole and Hugh Marshall Hole in a book called Of the Black Kings. There's a whole lot of work on, there's no end to good books on the subject. A lot of books written from European point of view, so you got to watch that. The one book written from an African point of view earlier, a little obsolete now, Chaka the Zulu, Thomas Mafolo. But the latest, the most up-to-date and best written book written from an African point of view, Mazozi Kamini's work, Emperor Chaka the Zulu. All right, now, there's no shortage of information on the period. After the Zulu War of 1906, the missionary-trained Africans began to come to power. The NACP was found in 1909. The ANC was found around 1913 under about the same kind of conditions, liberal whites support. And anytime things are found with the help of liberal whites, it's crippled from the beginning. Because their liberalism puts a damper on radical activity to the extent that it is neither coffee or cream. And while this seemed to be a trait that has some admiration attached to it, down the road you pay for it. So if you want strong organizations where you make decisions all the way, you have to find them yourself and finance them yourself. All right, now, the ANC is going to get weak later on, and strength is going to come to South Africa through a great labor union found by a young man from Nyasaland, Clement Kadele. All right, let us leave South Africa for a while and understand that the second cluster of wars, and the last one that we will deal with, was really West Africa. Now, once more, you have a different kind of Muslim. You have Islamic resistance to French rule along that coast. Secretary Ray's grandfather, Soumaré, that we'll come back to. You have Ousmane de Tourada against the French. You have in what is now Nigeria, the House of Fulani Wars. And after the House of Fulani Wars, the concession that made Nigeria. But the longest series of wars was really in what is now Ghana, the Ashanti or the Asante War. All right, the British wanted to take over the coast, take over the hinterland from the coast. But all they had was the coast. And the one thing that kept them from taking over the coast, over the hinterland, was the Asante people. All right. Now, the Asante people always move away from people trying to convert them to religions and politics not of their making, not of their choice. Now, had Nkrumah understood their culture, respected it, and got their cooperation, he would probably still be alive and probably would still be ruling Ghana quite well with their assistance. All right. The Asante people came out of a particular kind of culture. They are a Akan people. And they came down from the Niger River to the Volta River in 1076. But it was not until early in the 18th century that they began to reshape their destiny, and they reshaped that destiny under two men, a young king, Osara Tutu, and a priest, Akamfo Enochi. All right, now, the romantic story is this. The main Akan people, called Ashanti by the British, whose name is Ashanti, lived in the middle of Ghana, and there, as the vassals of another group, the Dikaras and the Domas, they had to have a spear carrier, almost a vassal prince in the dominant house. So they sent this young man to the dominant house, Osara Tutu. And there in the dominant house, he violated one of the basic rules of laying court to one of the young ladies of the house, something he wasn't supposed to do. So after a while, when she began to show some weight in some obvious places, a priest told him that you better escape, because when this is discovered and it's known that you are the culprit, this means war between your two people. Ultimately, the father had to send 2 or 3 sons to replace this one. Now, the priest told him, and this is part of the sustaining legend of the Santi people, that one day you will be king, and I will bring to you a golden stool that will be the ark of the covenant of the Santi people. 3 years after he is king, the priest appeared. The priest is also a magician. So he brings from the sky this golden stool. It's just a wooden stool inlaid with raw gold. And raw gold is not very attractive, incidentally. Don't look like much. I've seen the stool, and so it's a precious ornament. It's the holy grail of the Ashanti people. So I respect it in that regard. But this was the making of that people. But my main point is that the British wanted to capture it, knowing full well that this would break the spirit of the Ashanti people. And the British longed to move from the coast to capture this stool. And 1805, after the death of Osara Tutu, after the death of the great priest, and we can devote a lot of time to him, but that's not really what we're here for. He was also forerunner of gynecologist, a magician, and some of his work is still well known in Ghana. Another king came to power, Osara Tutu Kawamani, a British governor along the coast, said that he would come inland and take the golden stool. And he sent word to the governor, if you came inland, I will send your head back to the coast on a silver platter. So the fool did come inland, and the king kept his promise. This was the beginning of the Ashanti Wars that would last 100 years. And every time the British marched enough force, they would begin another Ashanti War. The next major war 1874, they burned the city of Kumasi. Still didn't win the war. Then they began to instigate to take over the hinterland during the reign of a young king, Campbell. They wanted him to pay so much indemnity, and he tried to get through to send his embassies to England to cut it off. Well, if you got money to send embassies to England, you should be paying the indemnity. He paid part of the indemnity. Finally, the Ashanti people realized that they would either have to give up the golden stool or give up the king. They decided to give up the king. Now, the British, in surrendering the king, forced the king to really bow, and he forced his face down onto the shoes of the British governor to humiliate him along with his mother. And he turns to his people and said, "My kinsmen, is this necessary?" This, of course, would start a war that the Ashanti people could not win. Now with Tempe in exile, a great woman came to power, Ye Ashanti Wa. The British still tried to capture the golden stool, to break the spirit of the Ashanti people. 1900, the British had sent an expedition into Kumasi. Now, an African Christian had gone to Kumasi and came back and told the British he had found the golden stool. And the British, the Africans had fixed a fake golden stool and aged it. But unfortunately, the thing fell, and the British discovered that that was new wood. Now the British began to search for the real golden stool. Governor Hobson came into Kumasi with a military force with his wife, why I don't know. White woman, white umbrella, black African holding the umbrella. Such a sight. This is a book called The Drama of Kumasi, and there's a whole lot of books on this subject, you know. But the scene is described best in the book called The Great Drama of Kumasi, and another one called The Siege of Kumasi. He says to Ye Ashanti Wa, the queen, "Why haven't you used this occasion to bring out the golden stool for me to sit on and send to her sovereign master, Queen Victoria?" He had to be a fool, because if he knew anything about the culture, not even an Ashanti king is permitted to sit on the golden stool. And the stool is brought out once a year in solemn ceremony so the people can see it. And the carriers of the stool are so trained that they must be physically behind the stool at all times. And if anyone walks in front of the stool during the ceremony, he is instantaneously tried and probably instantaneously killed. This is the most sacred object of the Ashanti people. See, Christian Western people think there's nothing sacred to anybody except them. This is their Ark of the Covenant. And so, this fool, Ye Ashanti was looking at him. Then she walks up and takes the gloves off his wife and decides she don't want them. He throws them back at her. Arrogant little woman. Now, her soldiers come and beg her to let them kill the governor. They have insulted our nation the last time. They begged for the right to kill him. And she said no. Someone asked her later on, said, inasmuch as you're going to kill him anyway, why didn't you let him kill him? Her answer was a compliment to women. She says, as I observed the scene, the junior spear throwers closest to the governor, and had I given them the order, they might have missed him. But the senior spear throwers were on the other side of the parade ground. Then I noticed the children jotting out, curious as children would be, and had I given them the order, they might have hit one of the children. So she told everybody to stay quiet. And yet, in the morning, she called her court to order and accused the men of not doing what they had begged her to let them do. In her classic and beautiful speech, ye men of Ashanti, I never thought that I would see the day when you would beg for the return of your king. But you would take such insult. Do you know who we are? We hark back to the days of Osara Tutu Kawamane, the great priest of anarchy. When she mentioned the great people of the Ashantis, what kind of men are you? He says, I don't know what you men would do. Come the sun on tomorrow, we women will be at war with the British. And if you men are not with us, go milk the cow, bring in the bread, take care of the children, take off the trousers, and you will no longer be welcome in our beds. To a man, when the war started, every man was in the battle. Her psychology had worked, and they stayed with her for 9 months throughout. It was not until the entry of the West Indian Regiment that Ye Ashanti gave up. She said, our brothers from the West have come to help us at last, and none too soon. She did not know the brothers were under the command of the British, and one arm was given command to fire on the English lieutenant and did, and another arm under Sergeant Gordon stopped. He said, we didn't come here to found our own people. Gordon was later tried in Jamaica. His son ran a grocery store in Harlem up until about 4 years ago. But after that, she gave up. She was sent to Seychelles Island along with her cousin, Campbell. Now, the most important thing here is that the agitation for the return of Ye Ashanti and King Campbell, led by a young Ghanaian, Casely Hayford, was converted into an agitation for independence. Casely Hayford had as his assistant another Ghanaian teacher named Joseph B. Danquah. Joseph B. Danquah was the schoolmaster of Kwame Nkrumah. On his deathbed, when Casely Hayford was dying, he said, send for J.P. Joseph B. Danquah inherited the mantle of political leadership with the hope to turn it over to Kwame Nkrumah. But when Kwame Nkrumah came back as a secretary to the United Gold Coast Convention, Kwame Nkrumah, instead of waiting for the mantle, seized the mantle, took the young people out of the United Gold Coast Convention and formed the Convention People's Party. Now angry, making Dankwa angry. Now Dankwa joins the opposition. It might have been a political mistake, it might not have been a political mistake. But Dankwa's idea is that you can join African traditionalism with modern traditionalism, with a modern state, and make a combination of states. And that if Africans wanted socialism, they can look back at their own history, which was a form of social living and communalism, and out of that, they can choose an ideological and a political and a spiritual way of life that will be as African as it needs to be, and take from the West anything it needs from the West, while still being distinctly African at all times, and never being a prisoner to the West. I think this point was missed. I think the point was missed by Nkrumah. I think the point was missed by most Africans. I think the point and the significance of the 19th century African, the 19th century thinker in the Caribbean was missed by the African world, and I think this is the main crisis in the African world, that we have missed the significance of these great thinkers of the 19th century. I don't think anybody in the Caribbean island today cares or knows about the writings of Robert Love, J. Albert Thorne, Marischal. These are thinkers that came, some came concurrent with Marcus Garvey, some came before Marcus Garvey, some taught Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was brilliant. He never took anything from second-rate people. Every time he turned to a thinker, it was a great thinker. In Ghana, great thinkers came at the end of the 19th and the 20th century, and early 20th century. Many of them we don't even read today. Great anti-nationalist, John Mansa Saba, and his whole scheme of how to use culture as an instrument of liberation, outlined in his book, Fanti Customary Law, Fanti Law and Constitution. Dankwa, the same way, is a canned doctrine of God. But another small book, which, in an argument I had with him, he only had 2 copies, he gave me one, and I still have it. Obligation in a Can Society. How did Can people arrive at right and wrong before Europe and before they were converted to Christianity? I'm saying that if you understand the 19th century, you have to understand the intellectual antecedents of the 19th century all over the world, because you have turned to cause something or another, but you have not turned to these great thinkers all over the African world. Men like Casely Hayford in West Africa. Thinkers from Nigeria. Zeke, the early writings of Zeke. Ezekwe. Saul Platje in Southern Africa. Du Bois, we have not even made the best use of in this country. the great black journalists of this country, T. Thomas Fortune, Monroe Trotter, they've not made the best use of. The three great pan-Africanists from Trinidad, H. Sylvester Williams, C.L.R. James, George Padmore. They have not made they came out. These are the results of the 19th century. These are the men in the 20th century who began to fashion a way of life for African people. And I'm saying that if we're going to chart our way in the last of the 20th century and look toward the 21st century, we have to understand that our own thinkers have sat down and tried to show us the way. And they were thinking for us. And that nothing that came from the European mind was meant to do anything but facilitate European control over the world. The European is clear about that. You have confusion about it. He has no confusion about what he wants in the world. He wants the world, all of it. All of it. He wants you as servants. And it does not matter whether he's left or right politically. And racism does not stop at the door of communism or socialism. And I say behind that, there's probably no place for the world to go except some form of socialism. But the socialism for you will have to be designed by you, for you. And there's certain ingredients that has to go into your socialism that's not in other people's socialism. Your spirituality has to go over into your socialism. Your church has to go into it. Clean it up. If you want to clean it up, you bring it over, clean it up inside. But you can't discard it. You discard the people. Take it, faults and all. Then correct it within the context, faults and all. But look again at the totality, not only of the warrior of the 19th century, but of the thinker of the 19th century. And I am reminded of something Willis Huggins of the Harlem History Club, that later became the Blyden Society, often said to me, if you cannot go all the way into a field, make a map leading into the direction that you want to go, so that the next person can see where you wanted to go and can pick up your map and follow it. We need clear directions now. We need people giving direction. We need to understand that our enemy had one thing in mind, and our enemy has been successful. He meant to break our self-confidence and destroy our historical memory. If you're going to go into the 21st century, you have to remember what you was in order to understand where you are, where you still have to go, and what you still must be. As we face the 21st century, there's a possibility that there will be 8 billion African people on the face of the earth. You've got an economy right there. Make sweaters for 1 billion people. Make shoes for 1 billion people. Have goods and services for 1 billion people. I'm saying that we have to look back at people that we have misjudged. And I'm saying that we have misjudged 3 main people in the 20th century whose ideas came out of the 19th century. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Marcus Garvey. Because all three of them were saying the same thing in a different way. Prepare yourself to manage nations, and prepare yourself by managing yourself. Because in the 21st century, we are either going to have to manage ourselves exceptionally well, we are going to have to manage nations, or we are going to be managed. And we have no choice about it, and we do not have as much time to make up our mind as we think we have. This is tomorrow's work, and the time to start tomorrow's work is always today. Thank you.
Dr. John Henrik Clarke, let's give another round of applause.
Briefly on like the origin of Africa, and what I mean with the origin of man. And I'm speaking in terms of since everything started in Africa with a black man, Australopithecus and so forth. I'm trying to figure out how, if we were great as I know we were, starting out in Africa as one man, and when you go into this genetic thing about the black as the dominant gene, how did we get in the position that we got in Africa? I can understand what's happened here in America. I understand that. But I don't understand, when you're speaking of the white man, I can't understand his origin if we were the original man.
Well, he's an offshoot of the African and partly the Asian. He's an offshoot.
Well, I know that I read somewhere where the continents broke away and so forth.
Well, that's the continental drift theory.
Right.
It has really nothing to do with what I'm saying, although that is a theory, and right. To some degree it's supportable.
Okay.
And because you could take the world and put it aside, and you find out that if you put it down like a jigsaw puzzle and try to put it together, right. Finally it fits. Right. Some of it fits. Right. So the chances are it could have been one landmass that broke apart. Right. So that's a possibility. So the continental drift and what you and I are talking about, this have to be two separate things.
Right. Well, you saying he's an offshoot, but then if he came as the offshoot, how did he get into Europe? Yeah.
How to get into power?
Yeah.
We got into power principally because the African has always manifested a trait that he still got. He's rather naive while other people are concerned. And he was totally unsuspecting. No, but the Western Asian was the first person to do harm, to invade Africa, to wreck cities, because the Africans didn't suspect them. Remember, the continent of Africa has never been protected. Still not protected. Whole continent. You know, Israel has more protection than the whole continent of Africa put together. They know they got to have protection, and then they go about it. The African still hasn't been convinced that he needs protection.
Now, the last thing I'd like to ask about the religious thing. Like, I keep reading about the mystery, what do you call this thing in Egypt, and the mystery school.
The mystery school.
Okay, now
this is the forerunner. This is the forerunner of what became Christianity. Part of the social thought.
What I'm asking
came out of that.
That was the forerunner. Now, what would you want to come out of, like the 5 books of Moses and Judaism? Then you had Christianity and Islam. Which way did that?
No, all the elements that went into the making of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam came out of the basic elements in Africa, out of the mystery system and the great lodge at Luxor, out of the book of the coming forth by the night and the day, and out of the basic African text. And the Bible is merely a copying, and sometimes poorly done. But you must understand that no one wants to deal with the Hebrew entry. And when what the Hebrews copied from the Africans. See, but when you go back to the original text, and go back to the copy, you can see it. You don't have to be less religious, but you could just look at the basic facts. And the most obvious thing is the 10 Commandments, copied from the negative, what they call the negative confession. The negative confession was never negative. If you say they're negative, that means you haven't read them. They're not negative. There's not one negative, one bad. Now, what the Africans, what you call the negative confession, were merely the declaration of faith and cleanliness and faithfulness. You stand before, after a given period, at the lodge at Luxor and at the schools of Africa, you stand before your teachers and say that I have not been guilty of bothering my neighbor's wife. I've not been guilty of thus and so. There's nothing negative about that. Now, I must admit that Moses did a very good job of choosing 10 out of the 42.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke, for a very inspiring lecture as usual. I had to go downstairs. I cut the tail end of this. I don't want to, but I'm interested in this to a large degree, some of the same things that you just tried to explain to this gentleman. What I'm interested in now, I've been to various lectures over the years. I haven't been able to attend them like the rest of the programs like I should. I buy books and I read quite a bit. But what I'm interested in, I'm basically interested, I'm very curious, is there any, where does this, say like today, these mysteries, I read quite a bit of this Hare Krishna literature, yogiism. I mean, I'm talking about the theory of yogiism and all this sort of thing. Does the African mysteries or the African influence or the African cultures in the ancient days, does that have any relative bearing on some of the concepts or the revelations or the meditations or what have you that they're bringing down to us today?
Yes, only the Africans never called them mysteries. Other people called them mysteries. They were inquiries into how life operated and how things did. Africans had a very simplified, holistic approach to religions, to the spirit. Only the Africans never called it religion, but spirituality, universal spirituality.
Okay, well, at the same time, I know, but what I want to know is, in other words now, if I would search back and really get involved. See, if I was a younger man, I got involved into, say, like the mysteries as they're referred to, according to African principles. I could go as deep into them as some of the volumes that I ran into about the, the control of the various influences, the spiritualism, the magnetism, the revelations, the inspirations that these people are supposed to be subject to after they involve themselves in these programs. I could do that.
You can do it. It will reach a dangerous point.
Okay, I understand it. Well, that's why I haven't played with it anymore.
It will reach a dangerous. That the mystery school is still in existence. There's certain people who belong to it.
In other words, what I'm saying, now, I started off years ago, somehow or another, I read quite a bit of Rosicrucian literature. I really didn't get involved with it, but I did read some of the theory. But the only thing, see, I got a little scared, see, because they were talking about white gods, white this.
I tend to distrust them.
I say, well, no, I don't want to get tangled up, but I know I'm not supposed to play with my mind foolishly. I have sense enough to know that. But I really, in other words, well, I did answer my question.
No, I tend to No, you're right. I tend to distrust the Rosicrucians. They're Westerners, and they tend to paint everything white.
Naya, but
Dr. Clarke, you mentioned the great Zulu wars and Zulu resistance against the Europeans. What do you attribute to the present day passiveness of the Zulu entity in South Africa today? And do you think they'll ever come out of it?
Well, it's a good question. The Zulus led one of the great wars in Southern Africa, and there's quite a few of them are still dynamic, but their leadership seems to be rather conservative today. And I don't believe the leadership is speaking for absolutely all of them. I've met some rather dynamic Zulus in my life. John S. Marks, Zulu head of radical, died on recently. And one of the most radical Zulus in Southern Africa was Campbell, one of the founders of the South African Communist Party, who quit the party on the national issue. The issue of nationalism. I think the Zulus will again be a major factor in Southern Africa. Probably not under the leadership of people like Both Lazy, but they will again be a major factor. The people who got it together culturally. Anytime you can hold your culture together, you can hold certain other things together. That's a great advantage. I don't give up on them. Plus, there's too many of them.
Well, that's another thing. They don't tell you the real population, I don't think.
Well, they're one of the largest groups in Southern Africa, the Zulu people. One of the largest single groups in Southern Africa. Thank you very much. Tonight, I'm going to talk about that period which shaped the United States and made it what it is. One of the reasons you don't understand nations, you don't understand the intention in the foundation of the nation and who the nation was made for and how it was shaped. I'm going to deal with the period 1776, the American Revolution and aftermath. I'm going to end on the eve of the Civil War. This is the period when the intention of the nation was shaped to be what it is today. You have a lot of assumptions about this nation because you have not understood how it was shaped and who shaped it and what they shaped it for. All right, let's look at the American Revolution and see what the American Revolution was about. It was not about the liberation of anybody. It was a family dispute between a younger branch of English-speaking people and an older branch of English-speaking people. And the younger branch seemed to have had enough energy to win the war after almost losing the war. Now, how did the American Revolution come about? England was so involved in wars at sea, internal religious wars. England had just become a Protestant country that had not settled down. England was in turmoil and could not hold all of its outer flank colonies intact. Now, while there had already been a revolt in its black colonies, Jamaica, and the outer colonies of the Caribbean, they did not have the military support to bring off a complete revolt that would free them from British domination. And besides, not being white, they did not have access to ammunition from Europe, other European nations, and did not have sympathy from other European nations, themselves slaveholders. Remember now, during the American Revolution, Lafayette came from France. Laflante, the French architect, came later to design the city of Washington, left in a huff, and a brilliant black mathematician who was looking over his shoulders, Benjamin Banneker, remembered the plans, put them together, and really Benjamin Banneker, not Laflante, is responsible for the design of Washington, D.C., one of the few American cities original design for some kind of traffic. If you look at Washington, the center of Washington, you can see the streets can take traffic. The smaller streets in these outer areas, they wasn't in the original plan. So now in the shaping of the United States, let's look, the British colony that is going to become the United States. You had a series of colonies, 13 different colonies with 13 different flags, all approving of slavery. Now in the lower South, where the worst of the scum of England was dumped, out of prisoners, out of workhouses, ladies of the evening and the night too, slavery was forbidden for a while. These were debtors and prisoners and the like. What you cannot understand is that Europe dumped its human garbage can into the so-called New World. The worst of that garbage can came to the United States. We inherited the worst of Europe. Not that there were flowers other places. Now in the New England states, some of the English came to escape persecution. Some of them were people of means. Mostly in the southern states, people trying to better their condition. Large number of them were indentures. All right, I'm getting to the point, and the point is, where did we fit into all of this? What had happened to the Africans in the United States between 1619 and 1776? Let's focus on 1776, because during that period, on the eve of the revolution, there had been contact between the Caribbean freeman and the black freeman of New England. And if you look at the biography, Russwam, Jamaica, Prince Hall, Barbados, Robert Campbell, Jamaica again, Peter Ogden, Antigua. If you look at the biography of all of these Caribbean people, not one called themselves a West Indian. Everyone thought of himself as an African person away from Africa, and saw the plight of one African person identical with that of other African people. All right, now the revolution comes. The alleged hero, I'm using the word advisedly, the alleged first man to give his life in the American Revolution was Christopher Adams. All right, I would not take a black hero out of history unless I got 10 to replace him. I'm going to put him in proper perspective. Christopher Adams, drinking with his Irish cut buddies, hanging out, everybody boasting about what they're going to do to the British. And he just stumbled out of the bar ahead of the rest of them and caught a bullet and got into his world's great accidental hero. All right. Because white people say so many bad things about us, it's not true. When they say something good that's not true, we might as well let it ride. Okay. Christopher Adams, of course, was one of the early casualties to the preface to the American Revolution. But as a matter of historical fact, the revolution hadn't started when he was killed. So to say that he was the first to die in the American Revolution is stretching a point. He did die. All right, let's give him all the honor due him. But he didn't die in the American Revolution because there was no revolution at the time. Okay. There were other black heroes in the American Revolution, and I wouldn't take him out unless I was going to put them in. There were genuine heroes in the American Revolution. So at first, Washington didn't accept black Americans in the American Revolution. But there were several families, the Brazilo family, the descendants still alive, some in Chicago and some around Boston. I've actually talked to someone on the telephone and greeted those in Chicago. because they were light complected, Washington couldn't tell where they belonged. So they fought right straight through the American Revolution. But now, the second brutal winter, Washington turned to a black friend, James Fortan. James Fortan was a tent maker and might be the first black middle class person of considerable wealth. And he told Fortan of the difficulty of the last winter, and he looked at some of the heavy wax matted tent cloth. He said, the tent cloth you are using is much better than the cloth in our breeches. Now, Jim, suppose you make some breeches out of that cloth, and the breeches made by James Fortan helped to save Washington's army during the second and the third, the last winters of the American Revolution. Peter Salem saved his life at one point near the end of the Revolution. There was an attempt to poison Washington, and Francis Tavern, Samuel Francis, who owned the tavern still exists down around Wall Street area, was of Caribbean descent, a Caribbean free man, and his daughter Phoebe noticed the attempt to poison Washington, because that's where Washington went to eat. And she told Washington's intelligence, and that saved Washington's life. Okay, Washington took a liking to Francis. Francis, after Washington became president, and he became steward to Washington, and Francis, being a good cook and a restaurant man, began to invite people to the White House to have special food on Washington's birthday. This is the origin of Washington's birthday, by this Caribbean restaurant man. Now, because he was light complected, the assumption is that he was white. There's no proof that he was white. His daughter Phoebe seemed to have taken more from her mother's side, and it wasn't much question that she belonged to us. Well, she saved Washington's life, and when some major tried to play up to her romantically to cover up the secret of the attempt to poison Washington, she wouldn't buy that angle. All right. Now, the second year of the war, Washington began to accept blacks in the army, and they began to distinguish themselves in a number of the battles in the American Revolution. A woman, Deborah Gannett, disguised as a man and fought in the American Revolution, a black woman, 9 months. And when they discovered her and discharged her with a pension, all this is recorded, they gave her a certificate of virtue. I'm saying that that was the worst thing they could have done for her, because her virtue wasn't even being questioned. And she didn't need this certificate. No one had thought about that one way or the other. She had to have same quarters with men and same bathing facilities with men, and for that 9 months, they said that she behaved like a lady and kept herself in a manner befitting the best of ladies. I don't know why they had to say that. They had to left it alone. Nobody would have thought about it. But be that as it may. Be that as it may, this was an outstanding black woman in the American Revolution. Also of mixed parentage. Now we have to do something which we haven't done. We haven't made an assessment of Africans of mixed parentage who were great patriarchs for our cause and who went on the other side with their light complexion and brought back secrets that damn near saved us in many occasions. We have been dealing with the cop-outs so much. We haven't even dealt with those who endanger their very lives in behalf of the black side of the family. Now, there were a number of others in the American Revolution, and my main point is that we fought in this war, and having fought in the war, we got nothing out of that either. When Washington proposed to some of these families that they send someone to fight in the war, when some of these aristocratic families did not want to send one of their sons, they sent a slave instead. And they sent the slave with the promise that after the war, the slave would be free. Now, while we know so much about this, there is an almost classical book with a title that offends me a little bit called The Negro in Colonial New England by Lorenzo Turner. Now, and yet it's the best documentation on the subject. The most scholarly documentation could be Benjamin Quarles' The Negro in the American Revolution. But here you have case histories of blacks who fought in the American Revolution. It is from one of these case histories that I get the story of Manny's Sam. This black New Englander fought in the American Revolution. His master, he was a slave, his master was probably named Manny, and Sam is the only name they gave him. So he fought in the American Revolution. No doubt he endeared himself to his white comrades who taught him how to read and write while he was in the army. When he came out and they tried to re-enslave him, he took it to court. And all of the veterans who had fought with him came from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and all the states around to be moral support during the trial. All he needed was moral support. But with his rough-hewed language that they had taught him, now he could read and write. He petitioned the Massachusetts court for his citizenship and his right to be a free man. And his petition is a great piece of American literature that could be printed separate and distinct from the trial and read as a piece of literature. Along the same line was the work of Amos Fortune, whose life started in the American Revolution, but who continued and was a vestryman in a white church after the American Revolution. All right, we have been the people who made the first overtures to get along with other people. Now let's see what went wrong and how it went wrong. The making of the Constitution. It is now the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. Now, who made the Constitution? Who were they talking about? What were their intentions in the making of the Constitution? Now, because we dream so much, we do not understand that the American dream was never dreamed for us. The American promise was never made to us. And if you face this reality, you might understand what you have to do. Now, they're making a constitution. 52 days of deliberation in Philadelphia. They produce a 2 or 3 page document. Jefferson wants to bring up the problem of slavery. Benjamin Franklin tells him, don't open this can of peas. Jefferson, a double-dealing liar, he writes so eloquently about liberty in the Constitution. He's had liaisons with several black women and had several children by black women, Sally Hamas being the most consistent one. I think he had 7 children by her. And if you go to Monticello, the Jefferson home, I talked about this so much they close off that stairway. There's a stairway leading from his bedroom to her bedroom. And yet Jefferson talked so much about liberty and justice and democracy, he never freed Sally Hamas, the slave woman who bore him 7 children. See, democracy for us was tainted from the beginning. Now, in the making of the Constitution, the Southern makers of the Constitution had a large non-voting constituency. Now, the Southerners were elected based on that constituency. They would not give the Southerner full credit for the slave, so they declared the slave to be 3/5 of a man. There is nothing in American literature, there is nothing in the amendments to the American Constitution that ever said you are a whole human being. Every black man, including me, who ever paid taxes, is paying taxes under false pretenses. We should never have paid any taxes, because it was taxation without representation, and still is. Now, in the whole concept of 3/5 of a man, many Southerners came to office based on the fact they had so many slaves in that constituency, though non-voting. So we see now the nation is shaping itself. Now, in essence, who was the nation shaped for? And remember this, and I'll repeat it if you don't understand it. This nation was made for originally free white Protestant males, middle class and up, those who agree with the prevailing political status quo and who own property. And when they say in this country, liberty and justice for all, that is the all they are talking about. And they are not talking about women. They're not talking about Catholics. They are not talking about Jews. Now you can play behind and be a servant to the power of the white male Protestant. But he will always be the dominant power in the country until he acknowledge and put in law and action that this country was meant for someone else other than himself. When someone asked recently whether the Constitution still prevails, Robert Harris, a professor at Cornell, asked, I hope not. I hope it don't still prevail. I hope there have been some changes. All these amendments, they still mean what they said originally. The president means what they said originally. This debate over this judge is what they said originally. But there are non-Protestants, whites, or pseudo-whites, who many times get a leverage by supporting the Gentile establishment and by rendering a service managing us. And they endear themselves to the Gentile establishment to the extent they keep us in line. Now you see where it started. Now you can see what other ethnic groups come in and manage your community, manage your stores. Why the government even give them money to assist them in doing it. And why you are not the resident entrepreneurs in your own community. Now I believe you can take back all of this community, any community, once you're organized to do so, and once you understand the global importance of African people in the world, you could actually do it. But you're so mesmerized by other people, you assume there's something magic about running a store, marketing food, and turning wheels in clocks and mechanics. And you forget that you did it first before they had shoes or lived in houses that had windows. What people make you forget, especially what you was, and your historical memory generally controls you right now. Okay, the revolution is over. Where are we? In the South, still slaves. There are some free blacks in the South, terribly restricted. No vote, no public accommodations. There's some free blacks in New England, really, where the voice of the free blacks got heard. But among those heard the most, Prince Hall and his African Lodge, the first black Masonic order. Now blacks are beginning to organize. They're beginning to express themselves in poetry. They're beginning to express themselves in the slave narrative. They're beginning to question whether they go to the side door or the balcony of churches. Soon, Richard Allen, James Varick would challenge the white church, and they would find the AME. Now the independent black church is on the way. You've got independent thinkers now. And we are approaching the 1800s. And as we approach the 1800s, we have the semblance of a church organization, the semblance of literary organization, the semblance of a protest movement. Now, as we came into the 1800s, let's look at that first half of the 19th century. Because this, in my opinion, was the most dynamic period in the history of Black America. It was the most dynamic period because these blacks were clear about what they wanted to do and what they had to do than you are right now. They didn't have a whole lot of hang-up illusions that you've got right now. They weren't thinking about integration. They were thinking about surviving as a people. In the late 90s, 1790s, a sea captain began to take blacks back to Africa using his own ships. Now, can you imagine now a sea captain with 3 ships doing trade on the sea of the world in the 1790s, and today we don't even own a decent rowboat? A master sailor with other sailors at his disposal. Now, as we came into the 1800s, more slaves escaping from the South, the birth of the slave narrative, a special kind of American literature. Finally, the Douglass School, Frederick Douglass, would begin publications. But 1800 itself, the first massive slave revolt, Gabriel Prosser in the Carolinas. Now you're beginning to see organization. Along with this kind of organization will be a different organization in the North. People are coming together. Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, the great minister Henry Highland Garnett. Poets are coming together, especially the great woman poet Elaine Wilkins Harper, Phyllis Whitley's period, and I don't dwell on that because I'm not a great Phyllis Whitley fan. I thought she misread history itself, but be that as it may. The importance of Phyllis Whitley is that she wrote. Women wasn't writing much poetry during that period, good or bad. The fact that she wrote fair poetry. And there are some atrocious lines in some of them. One that turned me off is that, I'm glad God took me from my pagan land, taught my pagan heart to understand. She didn't come from no pagan land. Africa was no pagan land. In her tribute to George Washington and to some lord. Well, the fact that I'm not a Phyllis Whitley fan is established, so I can go on. But during this period, a slave on Long Island produced the first cynical poem. And the poem went, my old master promised me when he died, he set me free. Lived so long his head got bald, got out of notion of dying at all. So this is the beginning of cynical in black poetry. So I didn't believe it. I don't believe the thing. All right, now, the black founding fathers as against the white founding fathers that Lerone Bennett writes about so beautifully in his work Before the Mayflower. And the thing about Lerone Bennett as against John Hope Franklin packs in a lot of historical information, but John's writing is so dull. I didn't say it's incorrect. It turns you off. Lerone Bennett is not as scholarly as John Hope Franklin, but Lerone Bennett makes the language sing. And he don't turn you off a bit. You read all it, pick up his book, you read the whole thing. John Hope, you go to sleep with, all these facts so packed on, without interesting explanation. But I think in Lerone Bennett's work, Before the Mayflower, in another work called The Shaping of Black America, the first two chapters, White Servitude, in the second chapter, First Generation, dealing with the first blacks to be brought to the United States. All right, now, let's look at the early period of Douglass. Let's look at the black giants, the people that Lerone Bennett called the black founding fathers. Better men, stronger men, true to democratic promise than the white founding fathers. Douglass, Allen, who founded the Independent Black Church, along with James Barrack, the founders of our large organization, Prince Hall, the role then of the Caribbean free men who came to the United States, the nationalist writings of Martin Delany, sometimes referred to as the father of black nationalism. He said that to Douglass, "I'm glad God made me a black man." And Douglass, who was part white, said, "I'm just glad God made me a man." All right. Now we're into the period where we're finding our voices. We're into the period when Douglass would write his famous narrative. Other slave narratives would be written. Now there's another famous slave revolt, this time in Virginia. Denmark Vesey, a black free man who had known languages. An unfortunate circumstance would literally hold up the revolt. When you study slave revolts in this country, this was the best planned slave revolt. Everything worked against it. The horses that were supposed to be in one place stampeded and wasn't in the place to take the men to another place. Rain and the bridge got washed out. And they couldn't contact the people on the other side. The circumstances tend to work against him. His secret keepers, while they kept the secret, they themselves couldn't connect. Yet when they caught him and tried to force a confession out of him, he told them nothing. And from his silence came the spiritual. He never said a mumbling word. In other words, he didn't give nobody's name away. Now, black expression is taking a new turn. It will take a dramatic turn 1829. Here we need to pause a little bit because this is a neglected aspect of our history. David Walker, an escaped slave who owned a second-hand clothing store and a pawn shop, began to write an appeal to the colored people of the world. Now, David Walker could well be the first pan-Africanist in literature, not to the colored people of the United States, to the colored people of the world. And if you listen to the record that Malcolm X made last, one of them, called Message to the Grassroots, and read David Walker's appeal, David Walker was the forerunner of a Malcolm X. David Walker appealed to all blacks to take up arms against their slave master and to take your chances, because continuing in slavery was a more difficult chance than gambling with your life with the hope of freedom. Now, David Walker's appeal enhanced some people and frightened some other people. Douglass did not associate himself with the appeal, though Douglass wanted freedom and thought there were less violent means to obtain it. David Walker, owning a second-hand clothing store where many of the sailors would come and pawn their winter clothes in the fall or in the spring and pick them up in the fall, when he wrote his appeal, he would put a copy in the pockets of these sailors. This is how the appeal got to England. Someone opened a copy and took it to an Englishman who published it. Now the appeal is becoming worldwide. And David Walker would mysteriously die soon after. Remember something that I've said repeatedly. Anytime a black man shows his people the real face of power and what to do about it in this country, he's either driven into exile, driven to suicide, or assassinated. And there is no exception. You can trace it from the death, the mysterious death of David Walker, to the death of Martin Luther King. There were some lesser known ones who died, who got killed, that didn't come to public notice. But one of three things are going to happen to you in this country if you show your people the real face of power and what to do about it. Now, so long as King was advocating nonviolence and sticking to that, he was comparatively safe. But when he engaged in sympathy for a garbage strike and began to advocate a poor people's march on Washington, uniting blacks and whites, this is the basis of political power. You're now challenging this nation in its direction. And we should have put a guard around him 24 hours a day, all sharpshooters, and somebody to watch the guards. We are people lacking in suspicion, overly trusting, nearly always the wrong people. but we treated them as guests at first. And this trait we still have. Many times we are kinder to the outsider than we are to the members of the family. This is a good trait properly used. When you want to find the strongest thing about a people, which is their concept of humanity, and that's one of the strongest things about us. The flip side of the strongest thing is also the weakest thing about you. You didn't watch who you were entertaining. You didn't watch who you were inviting to dinner. All right. The next revolt to frighten the slaveholders would be the Nat Turner Revolt, Hamilton Roads, Virginia. Also a well-planned revolt. In the Nat Turner Revolt, his secret keepers were spread across four states. And one of the secret keepers was his wife. This is why I took exception to the book Confessions of Nat Turner, because it made Nat Turner really a weakling lusting after a white woman. And there was nothing in history to prove that that was true. The scene was a violation of history. All right. Nat Turner's revolt probably caused more fear in slave owners than any other revolt. And what Nat Turner's revolt was inspired by, in part, was the revolt in Haiti. Finally, black sailors going between the United States and the Caribbean islands heard that somewhere on an island, slaves had revolted and set up a free nation. When that information got back to the United States, some blacks thought they could do the same thing. It was a different lay of land, and given the circumstances, they could not have done the same thing. The fact that they thought they could do the same thing was an act of bravery and an act of courage. In Haiti, you had a black majority. You had Haiti's everlasting hills. And if you go to Haiti and Jamaica, you would wonder how anybody stayed a slave anytime. Because you can go up in those hills and you can look down, you can see what's coming up at you, but what's coming up at you can't see you. And some good rocks properly tippled down will discourage them. And there's plenty of rocks on in those hills. And throw down enough big rocks, they'll change their mind. Because those hills are fortresses, and great fortresses. We didn't have that. We didn't have running space. We were on level ground too many times. We didn't have access to the forest. We couldn't get to the hills, although we were in a part of the country that had no appreciable hills. But the Nat Turner Revolt had said something to this nation about the ability of the slave to sustain a long revolt. Finally, when they captured Nat Turner, tried him, the most unique thing Nat Turner did was this bogus confession. In this confession, he told about every member of his group that he knew was dead. And he was absolutely sure he was dead, he'd talk about it. But if he escaped and still alive someplace, he didn't have nothing to say. When this white man who took down the confession, who hated his guts, kept pumping him for more information, asking him, are you sorry about all of this? You know how many people got killed? He kept emphasizing they were white people. And he let it be known that the consequences of a revolt, some people get killed, black and white. And the man persisted. He and Nat Turner in rags, blood dripping all over him, when whites tried to beat him to death before he could get the gallows up while they're building the gallows. Finally, they took him to the gallows, had the rope around his neck. And this white man is still pushing him for questions. Don't you think, aren't you sorry about what you did? Do you understand that you're going to die? Nat Turner bravely tilted his head and looked at the fool and said, didn't Christ die? That was the end. He just went on like a man. No weeping, no crying, no begging nobody to spare his life at all. He said, didn't Christ die? Then they hung him. They ain't hung no crying man. They ain't hung no man begging for his life. He gave it up for a cause. He understood that before he started, that he would have to give it up. Now, the Nat Turner revolt brought into being large numbers of laws, black codes, all kinds of codes. Douglas's voice is stronger now. A period in black America often forgotten is emerging now, the convention period, what is called the Negro Convention movement. We have always been and still are the meetingest people in this country. We began before slavery to call meetings. And those free blacks were calling meetings, debating things. They created a literature, they created a church. Now they've created a convention movement. Let's have a convention. Let's eat and talk. And this is what they began to do. Part of the talk was about whether we would stay here or go back to Africa. Out of this talk would come black association with the American colonization movement. The American colonization movement, stretching even into the South, mostly financed by whites. Frederick Douglass peeped their hand and said, if you whites want to give blacks free trips back to Africa, why don't you free some slaves and give them the trip? I think they would enjoy it more. Frederick Douglass saw that they were trying to get the free black out of America, especially the agitators. So Frederick Douglass, while not against people going back to Africa, was against the white-controlled colonization movement. If you understand the colonization movement and how it was organized by liberal whites and some hypocritical whites who merely wanted to use the organization as a listening post to feel the pulse of black America, If you understand that, you'll understand the NAACP right now. A lot of people think the NAACP started out as a black organization. Then you haven't read the history. Started off as a liberal white organization, and they invited blacks in on their terms. And they're still mixed up based on the fact that people haven't studied foundation. When you understand what is at the foundation of something, then you can understand its intent. All right. Frederick Douglass would contact John B. Russwurm, the alleged first graduate from an American college. It was later proven that there was another black American who graduated from a college a few months earlier. This is not an important item, which one graduated first or last. Well, anyway, I'm willing to let Russwurm have the job because he did such a good job in editing Freedom's Journal, and the other one didn't do much for us, and he got lost in the shuffle, and we never know what happened to him anyway. Russwurm made a major contribution to the literature of the argument for freedom. And his place in literature, his place in our literature of liberation is secure. When he stopped editing Freedom's Journal and decided to go to Liberia as the governor of Cape Palmas province, he established a newspaper, the Liberian Herald, that is still in existence. And his answer to Douglass is that while I agree with you that this is a white-run organization, and he was sponsored by the Virginia branch of the Colonization Society, at least we have the opportunity to show whites that we can control a nation. Now here is where some mistakes began to be made in relationship to the Western black and Africans. The mistakes still being made. Many of the Christian blacks went to Africa with the attitude they're going to civilize their heathen brothers, not knowing that the people of Liberia were Mende-speaking people who had brought into being the old empire of Ghana, Mali, and the last of the great African nation states, Songhai. Literally the most civilized Africans on the face of the earth at that time. And here these bunch of fools that a white man's version of Christianity going back to Africa to civilize their heathen brothers who wasn't heathens in the first place, were more civilized than they are in the second place. Now, the American Liberian and the Caribbean Liberian, because they went from the Caribbeans and from the United States, mostly church-oriented. And up until the emergence of Sergeant Doe, who's probably a CIA agent, Liberian, as against descendant of America or Caribbean Liberian. Liberia was run poorly by church members. People in the Congress were deacons, and the ministers were presiding elders. That were all church people misunderstanding the African concept of spirituality as against the European rehash of African spirituality that he called Christianity, that he began to remake in Europe at the conference at Nicaea. Now, this is not what the lecture is about. We have to understand Africans had a spirituality before Judaism, Christianity, or Islam were interpreted by outsiders. And what we are talking about is out of this great body of spirituality in Africa came Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I'm saying that Africans had the original copy, and they made carbon copies. This is why I'm still willing to refer to it as carbon copies of the original spirituality. Because in African religions, it wasn't departmentalized. It wasn't a Sunday thing. It was a thing that ran through the totality of your life and determined everything in your life, including your diet, your wife, and your child, your village, where you stayed. You didn't go to church on Sunday. Your religion was a part of your life. Your spirituality was a part of your life all of the time. And in this, Africans respected all living things. Everything with life got respect, including the cockroach, including the tree, including running water. You go to Egypt today, they had a god of the Nile called Happy. The Catholic Church would later break this down into saints. The African had an overall spiritual force, and that God had many helpers. All the Catholic Church did just to call them saints. So Happy was the God taking care of the Nile. A woman was the goddess, Nut, taking care of the sun. Her job was to take in the sun in the evening, put it in her body, and let it out in the morning. They assigned something to everybody. But that didn't mean that they did not believe in the oneness of the spirituality that men would later call God. They create denominations that would fight among themselves. There wasn't but one overall spirituality taking care of everything. Then someone broke it down into religions and denominations. That was probably man's highest hour of spirituality and purity on this earth. Everything had a soul, including the dog or the pig. Was the highest hour of respect for humanity too. All right, now let's get back to the end of this first half of the 19th century. What do we have now in motion? We have the embryo of American industry. You have the beginning of the experimentation that's going to be the cotton gin. Ideas taken from blacks. You have cotton in demand in Europe, but Europe is not getting it fast enough. You do not have enough work for the slave to do in the South. The cotton gin is going to change the whole nature of slavery. It's going to make cotton king. Now, by the time the cotton gin was invented, the abolitionists, mostly New Englanders, black and white, had started the campaign for the liberation of the slave. Now the South would answer them truthfully, a truth that we're still not willing to deal with. They would tell the New Englander, you sold us the slave, and now you northern abolitionists who took our money for the slave are now telling us to liberate the slave. Now you're showing the slave how to escape. You're a bunch of hypocrites. Now on face, they were right. The North was a bunch of hypocrites then, a bunch of hypocrites now. The North could have put enough pressure on the South to eliminate Jim Crow without any fighting, without any civil rights movement. And they didn't do it. The North, the industry of the North, the money of the North, was gaining more and more control over the South. Literally a stranglehold on the South. Now the South is beginning to demand a greater share of the wealth of the country. But the way they arranged it, the New Englanders who had produced the industry would refine the raw material, mostly coming from the South. They wanted to keep the South agrarian in farms. They wanted the woods from the South, the hides from the South. But the South partly willing with the agreement that you leave my labor supply alone. That without slaves, I can't even send you the raw material with the same degree of profit that I've been sending it to you. Now the argument is between two branches of English-speaking people. Now if you think white people fought a war for 4 years, cutting each other apart for you, then it wasn't water you was drinking this morning. You just picked up the wrong glass. They not only didn't do it, they would not have done it. Slavery was now becoming an emotional issue, an issue for debate between two men who did not believe and said publicly, repeatedly, they did not believe that the slave would ever be the social equal of other people, that he would ever fit into the society. And the person who said it best and said it more often was Abraham Lincoln. Now, on the eve of this catastrophe, some smart Missouri lawyers decided to put to task the escape slave law and the assumption that if a slave went into so-called free territory, he would automatically be free. So they used a slave who had previously put the law to a test without success, and who for quite some time was trying to buy his own freedom and had bought the freedom of some other members of his family, but had not accumulated sufficient money to buy his own. What looked to be a mild Uncle Tommy's slave called Dred Scott. Dred Scott was an activist against slavery before, Whether those who chose him to make the test case knew it or not is something history hasn't revealed to us. But Dred Scott was no mild, inactive slave, peaceful in slavery. So they went through the trial. The trial got the attention of the whole nation because the way the trial went would determine the condition of slavery in the United States. Finally, the trial is over, and the decision comes from the Chief Justice, Taney. Who is Taney? You've got to understand this. Taney is a second-generation Irish. His own family had been indentures, white slaves. Now, he is rendering a decision against a black slave. And that decision he rendered in 1857 still holds for this nation. And you'd better remember it. He said, no black man has any rights that a white man is bound to respect. That is the global approach between black men and white men this very day. No matter what the law is, you only have those rights he chooses to respect, and none he feels bound to respect. That's what Howard Beach was about. That's what the debate with this judge is about. That's what our life in this country is out of kilter with the rest of the lives of people, and we are a nation within a nation searching for a nationality. No people can free themselves unless they have a nationality, an identity. An Italian would say Italian American, German would say German American. He's putting a nationality onto his citizenship. So long as you say American, you're out. I'm a Caribbean person, I'm a Britisher. Britisher by way of what? Who made you a Britisher? You wasn't no Britisher when they brought you out of Africa. And we were no Americans when they brought us out of Africa. The name of a people must always relate them to land, history, and culture. And anytime a people give you their name, if the name fails to reflect a relationship to land, history, and culture, you have called them out of their name, and they are confused about the role of a people in the world. No people can establish themselves in the world until they relate to land, history, and culture. Over and above that, their slave master chose for them. And so long as they choose a name out of their slave master's culture, they are a slave to that slave master. All right, now, we are approaching the Civil War. The black abolitionist has done great service, many times greater than the whites. John Brown has approached Frederick Douglass to join him. Frederick Douglass has refused. Not only because it is violent, but he's assuming that if blacks joined him, it would give America an excuse literally to commit genocide against all the blacks. And he could well have been right. John Brown pursues his course that leads to Harper's Ferry and his death. John Brown may well have been the only white person who paid full dues in our club. The rest of them associate members. John Brown might be a full member. And the only way to be a full member, you got to lay it on the line, and if necessary, give it up. All right, now we are approaching a period in history when America is made facing a catastrophic civil war that will remake the country. We would, of course, fight in that civil war in large numbers, and we would distinguish ourselves. After the Civil War, we would put down old troubles and pick up some new troubles. And the new troubles are still with us and stayed with us through the end of the second half of the 19th century. That's what the next lecture is going to be about. Thank you very much. Yes. Give me time.